"Shut up and load the bags," right, they yelled, dismissing his concerns about balance calculations. Minutes after takeoff, his engineering knowledge was all that stood between safety and disaster. Welcome to Untold Lives. Before we begin this story of overlooked expertise and hidden knowledge that saves lives, tell me in the comments, what city are you watching from today? And if you believe these stories of forgotten heroes deserve to be heard, hit that subscribe button. Denver International Airport never slept, and neither did Thomas Chen. At 59, with calloused hands and a back that ached from years of heavy lifting, he had worked ground crew for Alpine Airways for 8 years. Every morning at 5 a.m., he would clock in, grab his safety vest, and begin the methodical process of loading baggage, cargo, and freight into the bellies of commercial aircraft. To everyone around him, Chen was just another baggage handler. The pilots barely acknowledged him. The flight engineers treated him like furniture. The younger ground crew called him Old Tom and assumed he was there because he couldn't find better work. They had no idea that Thomas Chen had spent 23 years as a senior aerospace engineer for Boeing, where he had designed loading systems, calculated weight distributions, and authored safety protocols that were still in use across the industry. Chen had retired early in 2016 when budget cuts eliminated his department. At 51, he was considered too old to be rehired elsewhere in aerospace and too specialized for most other industries. Ground crew work at the airport paid the bills and kept him close to the aircraft he had spent his career understanding, but it came with a cost. Every day, he watched procedures being done incorrectly, safety protocols being ignored, and problems developing that no one else seemed to notice. The worst part was that when he tried to speak up, no one listened. It started small. Chen would notice baggage being loaded in configurations that shifted the aircraft's center of gravity beyond safe parameters. He would approach the crew chief, explain the issue, and suggest corrections. "Thanks, Tom," the crew chief would say dismissively, "but the computer calculates all that stuff automatically. Just stick to loading what we tell you to load." Chen would nod and return to work, knowing that the computer systems only worked when the data input was accurate, and that human error in cargo placement could override any automated calculation. The problems escalated when Alpine Airways began accepting larger freight contracts to boost revenue. The airport was handling more cargo flights, heavier loads, and tighter schedules. Corners were being cut, and Chen could see the potential consequences building like storm clouds. The breaking point came on a Tuesday morning in March when Flight 447, a cargo route to Phoenix, was being loaded with an unusual mix of freight. Chen was assigned to the forward cargo hold while 2 younger workers, Jake and Marcus, handled the aft section. As Chen began reviewing the load manifest, he immediately saw the problem. The cargo distribution would place too much weight behind the aircraft's center of gravity, making the plane tail-heavy and difficult to control, especially during takeoff when precise balance was most critical. Chen climbed out of the cargo hold and found Jake and Marcus joking with the flight engineer, a man named Peterson who had been with Alpine for 3 years and carried himself with the confidence of someone who thought experience and expertise were the same thing. "Peterson," Chen said, approaching with the manifest in his hand, "we have a balance issue with this load." Peterson barely looked up from his clipboard. "What kind of issue?" "The freight distribution. We've got 4,800 pounds of machinery in the aft hold, but only 2,200 pounds forward. That puts the center of gravity 8.3 inches behind optimal." Peterson frowned, not at the numbers, but at Chen. "How would you know that?" "Because I can calculate it," Chen said simply. "The load needs to be redistributed. Move about 1,300 pounds of the machinery forward, or add ballast to balance it out." Jake laughed from where he was securing cargo straps. "Listen to Professor Tom over here, talking about math." Marcus joined in. "Yeah, Tom. Leave the engineering to the engineers. You just load the boxes where we tell you." Peterson looked at Chen with the kind of expression reserved for someone who was clearly overstepping boundaries. "Tom, I appreciate your enthusiasm, but I have a degree in aerospace engineering. I know how to calculate weight and balance." "So do I," Chen said quietly. Peterson's expression hardened. Look, old man, I don't know what you think you know, but this is my aircraft, my responsibility. The load calculation is correct according to our systems. Your systems are only as good as the data you input, Chen said, and the cargo placement I'm seeing doesn't match what's on the manifest. Shut up and load the bags, Peterson yelled, loud enough that other ground crew members turned to look. You're a baggage handler, not an engineer. Stick to what you know. Jake and Marcus exchanged glances and went back to their work, but Chen could see them smirking. The older ground crew members pretended not to notice the confrontation, but Chen knew they were listening. Chen stood there for a moment, holding the manifest, looking at Peterson's face, and seeing the kind of pride that refused to accept information from someone it perceived as inferior. He had seen that expression before, in boardrooms and engineering meetings, but never from someone whose mistakes could kill people. The center of gravity will be off, Chen said one more time. That aircraft is going to be tail-heavy. Get back to work, Peterson snapped, before I report you for insubordination. Chen nodded slowly and walked back to the cargo hold. He had done his job. He had identified the problem and reported it through proper channels. What happened next was out of his hands. But as he continued loading freight, Chen couldn't shake the knowledge that Flight 447 was going to be dangerous. The mathematics were clear in his head, as precise as they had been during his 2 decades of professional engineering. The aircraft would be controllable on the ground, but during takeoff, when the pilot pulled back on the controls to rotate the nose up, the tail-heavy configuration would cause the aircraft to pitch up more aggressively than expected. If the pilot overcorrected, the aircraft could stall. If he didn't correct enough, the aircraft might not achieve proper climb attitude. Either scenario could result in catastrophe. Chen finished loading his section of the cargo hold, secured the restraints, and signed off on his paperwork. As he walked away from the aircraft, he made a decision that would change everything. He pulled out his phone and called the FAA safety hotline. This is Thomas Chen, reporting a safety concern at Denver International Airport, he said when the operator answered. I have reason to believe Flight 447, scheduled to depart in 30 minutes, has a dangerous center of gravity issue. The operator took his information and explained that they would contact the airport immediately. Chen hung up and walked to his supervisor's office to clock out early, claiming he felt sick. It wasn't entirely untrue. 40 minutes later, as Chen was driving home, his phone rang. It was his supervisor. Tom, I need you to come back to the airport immediately. Why? What happened? Flight 447 had to make an emergency return. Pilot reported severe control problems during takeoff. They're investigating, and your name came up. Chen turned his car around. By the time he arrived back at the airport, Flight 447 was surrounded by emergency vehicles, FAA investigators, and Alpine Airways management. The aircraft had landed safely, but Chen could see from the skid marks on the runway that it had been a difficult landing. Chen found his supervisor, Bill Rodriguez, standing near the gate with several men in suits. Tom, Rodriguez said, his face grim. These gentlemen are from the FAA. They want to talk to you. The lead investigator, a woman named Sarah Mitchell, approached Chen with a mixture of professional curiosity and barely concealed urgency. Mr. Chen, I understand you called in a safety report about this flight. Yes, ma'am. I identified a center of gravity issue during loading. Can you explain what you observed? Chen pulled out his copy of the load manifest and began walking Mitchell through the calculations. As he spoke, he noticed the expressions of the people around him changing. Rodriguez looked confused. Peterson, who had been summoned from the aircraft, looked increasingly pale. Mr. Chen, Mitchell interrupted, these are fairly sophisticated calculations. What's your background? 23 years as a senior aerospace engineer for Boeing, Chen said. I specialized in aircraft loading systems and weight distribution protocols. The silence that followed was complete. Peterson stared at Chen as if seeing him for the first time. You're an aerospace engineer? Was, Chen corrected. Now I'm ground crew. Mitchell looked at her notes, then at Chen. Mr. Chen, our preliminary assessment confirms your analysis. The aircraft was loaded in a configuration that placed the center of gravity 8.4 inches aft of recommended parameters. The pilot reported that during rotation, the aircraft pitched up more aggressively than expected and became difficult to control. She paused, looking directly at Peterson. If Mr. Chen hadn't reported this, and if the pilot hadn't been experienced enough to manage the situation, this could have resulted in a stall and crash during takeoff. Peterson's face had gone completely white. Jake and Marcus, who had been standing nearby, were no longer smirking. "How did this happen?" Rodriguez asked. Mitchell consulted her notes. "According to our investigation, the cargo was loaded according to the computer-generated plan, but the actual weight of some freight containers was different from what was logged in the system. The discrepancy was enough to create the dangerous condition, Mr. Chen identified." She turned to Chen. "You recognized this during the loading process?" "Yes, I tried to report it through proper channels, but..." Chen looked at Peterson, then back at Mitchell. "My concerns were dismissed." Mitchell's expression hardened as she turned to Peterson. "You were informed of a potential safety issue and chose not to investigate." Peterson opened his mouth, then closed it. Finally, he said, "I didn't know he was qualified to make that assessment." "His qualifications were irrelevant," Mitchell said sharply. "Any safety concern from any crew member should be taken seriously and investigated properly. That's basic protocol." Over the next 2 hours, Chen found himself at the center of the investigation. He walked investigators through his calculations, explained how he had identified the discrepancy, and described the response he had received when he reported it. The FAA team reviewed security footage of the loading process, interviewed other ground crew members, and examined the aircraft's actual weight and balance data. As the investigation continued, word spread through the airport about what had happened. The baggage handler who had prevented a potential disaster was actually a former Boeing engineer. The story took on a life of its own. That evening, Chen was called into a meeting with Alpine Airways senior management. He expected to be fired for going over Peterson's head and calling the FAA directly. Instead, he found himself sitting across from the airline's director of operations, Martha Sullivan, and their head of safety, David Kim. "Mr. Chen," Sullivan began, "we owe you an apology. And more than that, we owe you our gratitude." She slid a folder across the table. "We're offering you a position as Senior Ground Operations Engineer. It would involve oversight of cargo loading procedures, safety protocol development, and training for ground crew supervisors." Chen looked at the offer, then at the two executives. "What about Peterson?" Kim answered. "Mr. Peterson is being reassigned to a position where his decision-making won't directly impact flight safety. He'll also be required to complete additional training on safety reporting procedures." "And Jake and Marcus?" "They'll receive counseling about workplace respect and safety culture," Sullivan said. "What happened today cannot happen again." Chen was quiet for a long moment. "For 8 years, I watched procedures that could have been improved. I saw problems that could have been prevented. I tried to speak up, and I was told to stay in my lane." He looked up at both executives. "If I take this position, I need to know that safety concerns will be taken seriously, regardless of who raises them." "Absolutely," Kim said immediately. "And I want to implement a system where any ground crew member can report safety concerns directly, without fear of retaliation." Sullivan nodded. "Done." Chen signed the papers. 6 months later, Alpine Airways had implemented new cargo loading procedures based on Chen's recommendations. The airline's safety record improved significantly, and several other carriers adopted similar protocols. Peterson remained with the company, but in a different role. He and Chen worked together occasionally, and while their relationship was professional rather than friendly, Peterson had learned to listen when safety concerns were raised, regardless of the source. Jake and Marcus both approached Chen separately to apologize for their attitude. Marcus eventually asked Chen to mentor him, and Jake transferred to a different department where he felt more comfortable. Chen continued to work ground crew shifts, but now he also spent time in the office, reviewing procedures, training supervisors, and investigating safety reports. His colleagues no longer called him Old Tom. They called him Mr. Chen, or, more often, simply the engineer. The most significant change, however, was cultural. Ground crew members at Alpine Airways knew that their observations mattered, that their concerns would be heard, and that preventing accidents was more important than preserving hierarchy. Chen had spent 8 years being dismissed, overlooked, and told to stay in his lane. But in the end, his expertise couldn't remain hidden when lives were at stake. The aircraft didn't care about his job title or his age or the assumptions people made about him. Physics and engineering principles operated according to their own rules, and those rules demanded respect. Sometimes the most valuable knowledge comes from people whose worth we've overlooked. Thomas Chen spent 8 years being treated like just another pair of hands, when he was actually one of the most qualified people at the airport to identify the problem that almost caused a disaster. He didn't need recognition or respect to do his job well. But when those in authority refused to listen, when pride and assumptions blocked critical safety information, the consequences could have been catastrophic. Chen's story reminds us that expertise doesn't always come with the title we expect. Sometimes the person loading bags knows more about aircraft than the person in the cockpit. Sometimes the most important voice in the room belongs to someone everyone else is ignoring. Have you ever worked with someone whose true expertise was hidden beneath assumptions about their role? Share their story in the comments. Let us know what city you're watching from. Subscribe to Silent Legends. We honor the overlooked experts, the dismissed professionals, and the hidden knowledge that keeps us safe. Because in the end, aircraft don't care about hierarchy. They only care about physics, engineering, and the people who understand both well enough to speak up when something's wrong.